Our top headlines this morning, horrific images are emerging of what Russian forces left behind after pulling back from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. And we do want to warn you, the images are disturbing and graphic, but it's what's happening now. The pictures and videos are from the town of Bucha, northwest of the capital. They show widespread devastation with dozens of bodies lying scattered around the city. Some of the victims had their hands tied behind their backs. Others reportedly had close-range gunshot wounds and signs of torture. Residents say Russians would go from building to building, take people from the basements where they were hiding, check their phones for evidence of anti-Russian activity before taking them away or shooting them. According to the city's mayor, around 270 local residents were buried in 2 mass graves, and at least 40 dead bodies were left in the streets. Ukrainian officials say more than 400 bodies have been found in Kyiv and in the surrounding area as well.
And Ukrainian President Zelensky is calling this genocide, describing it as scenes from a horror movie. President Zelensky releasing a message on social media about Bucha. Speaking in Russian, he said, quote, "I want every mother of every Russian soldier to see the bodies of the killed people in Bucha, in Irpin, in Hostomel. What did they do? Why were they killed? What did the man who was riding his bicycle down the street do? Why were ordinary civilians tortured to death in an ordinary peaceful city? Why were women strangled after their earrings were torn out of their ears? How could women be raped and killed in front of the children?" He went on, "Their bodies were mocked even after the death. Why did they crush the bodies of people with tanks? What did the Ukrainian city of Bucha do to your Russia? How did all of this become possible? Russian mothers," he said, "even if you raised marauders, how did they also become executioners? You couldn't help but know what's inside your children. You could not help but notice that they are deprived of everything human. No soul, no heart. They killed deliberately and with pleasure," end quote from President Zelensky.
Yeah, I mean, really strong words. And, you know, Mike, and the world is responding. Here's, of course, the Post, New York Post, talking about genocide. Wall Street Journal reports of atrocities stir outrage. The Times also talking about it. We saw the headline. I thought one of the best headlines I've seen. We just put up there, worse than ISIS. What we're seeing here is worse than what ISIS did. But you know, Mike, a few weeks ago, Joe Biden, people were attacking Joe Biden for calling Putin a war criminal, and then for saying a butcher, and that Putin must go. I understand their diplomatic niceties. We have to be careful of trying to find an off ramp to this, but I'm not exactly sure what other words fit him.
The President of the United States was absolutely correct when he described Vladimir Putin as a war criminal and a butcher. And he was absolutely correct when he stated early on that he thought that Russia would invade Ukraine. Everybody said, "Oh, no, Russia won't invade Ukraine." He was right. My question to you, Richard, is, given what we have seen, given the evidence that's been right there in front of the world's face, how is it that Russia is allowed to remain as one of 15 members of the United Nations Security Council?
Look, the United Nations and the Security Council was created as a place to talk about peace, and particularly among and between the great powers. It was never meant to be used by one against others. This was simply the DNA of the institution. It's also the weakness of it. When one of the great powers, in this case Russia, is in the dock, the organization is feckless. So what you've got to do is work around it, and that's why we have this informal coalition, beginning with NATO, but other countries that are doing the sanctions, that are doing the military support for Ukraine. One day, God willing, we'll rebuild Ukraine, we'll deal with war criminality, we'll deal with reparations and all that. But the UN, the Security Council, will just be something that will be irrelevant or an obstacle. It is useless. And again, look, it was useless during the Balkan Wars. NATO had to use military force at the end of the day because Russia used its veto in the Security Council. And during the Korean War, Interesting enough, the Russians were boycotting. We went to the General Assembly. We got a Uniting for Peace resolution after North Korea invaded in 1950. So again, it was a workaround, essentially, around the Security Council. That is the history of the United Nations. When a major power like, China now, with the Uyghurs or something like that, you can't have a serious conversation in the Security Council. That's simply the way it works.
So what can be done at the General Assembly? Can you go to the General Assembly and set up the safe zones like we set up in Syria? James Jeffrey suggested that we do that. A couple of people have pushed back saying it's not possible.
Two problems. One is I'm not clear you got the votes. Look how much
in
of
the General
world,
Assembly.
Look how much of the world is sitting on its collective
Even
hands.
this morning?
Even this. Well, we'll see. I think there's two interesting questions. One, whether this moves any of the rest of the world. More than 50 countries in Africa, south of the Sahara, countries in Latin America, the Middle East. Second of all, does it get the Europeans, particularly the Germans, to say, well, it's going to take 3 years to get off our thirst for Russian gas. And if we do anything faster, it's going to really hurt our economic growth. Well, maybe the time has come to accelerate that and pay a price. Look at the price that people of Ukraine are paying. Why can't the people of Germany and Europe begin to pay more for price too?
Again, why would anybody be against, in Europe at least, a humanitarian zone in the western part of the country?
Well, again, the question is going to be who's going to patrol it, how it's going to be done, and so forth. Look, militarily, these are complicated things, and I think we're talking about more than a humanitarian zone in the West. We're talking, I don't think the problem here, by the way, is young Russian soldiers acting without discipline. What Mika described, the idea of the videoing and so forth, this suggests to me somewhere an order has come. Somewhere they have said, we have got to terrorize the people of Ukraine in order to break their will, in order to depopulate their cities.
Right.
Exactly.
This is not simply undisciplined conscripts. This is something more.
And by the way, we would love to. I think it may be comforting to just put this all on Vladimir Putin. I think Zelensky asks the right question of Russian mothers, and asks the right question of those Russian soldiers. This is what Russia did in Aleppo. This is what Russia did in Chechnya. And by the way, it's not even just Putin. This is what Stalin did. You look at the Katyn massacre. They systematically executed in 1940, systematically lined up and executed 22,000 Polish officers. Just lined them up and kept shooting them dead till they killed 22,000. This is what Russia does. And we keep hoping for a new Russia. Right. That's obviously never going to happen, though, as long as Vladimir Putin is where he is, and as long as the attitudes that obviously are putting him at approval ratings of maybe 60, 65, 70% in his own country change.
Right. So it's like I don't think anybody. There's nothing surprising about this, right? There really has been nothing surprising. But he's been a war criminal for a long time. He's used chemical weapons in Aleppo. He's in Grozny. Anybody who's been a student of Putin for the last 20 years would have said that this is wholly predictable, and yet, as Richard knows, and as everybody knows, it's getting kind of incredible to see. First, George W. Bush. I looked into his soul. I looked into Putin's soul, and then you had Barack Obama, also a light touch on him. Donald Trump, obviously the most egregious. And then people get mad at Joe Biden for being the only one in that string to say something, as you guys were saying, which is just obviously true. All of those things are correct. He's the first American president of the century.
In 20 years.
To address Vladimir Putin and actually just called it as he saw it, with perhaps he broke maybe a little China, but in the end, the moral clarity of it was the right place to be. But I think it raises
that hasn't been tried.
But then it raises this question, which is, we've all from the beginning of this war till now, we've said, what will happen as this war progresses? This will get worse. When it gets worse at some point, the pressure to do more will ratchet up. And I guess the question at this point for Joe Biden, for the West broadly, but Joe Biden's been the leader of the West, right? So the question is, what now? Like, what if once you've called him a butcher, and once you've said he basically said he must go. And you're now in this place where this is going to be not the worst thing that we see, and there's still chemical weapons out there that could be used on any given day. What do we want Joe Biden to do about that?
There's still chemical weapons, Mike. There's still nuclear weapons. They're tactical nuclear weapons. Yeah. And if anybody believes there's a certain person that I saw on TV saying, oh, we don't need to worry about Putin using nuclear weapons. We need to worry about Vladimir Putin using nuclear weapons. That's a reality. So we're going to have, I always talk about dialectical thinking. We can hold two opposite thoughts in our minds at the same time, or two competing thoughts in our minds at one time. One, he is a war criminal. He's real. Two, he's got more nuclear weapons than anybody else, and he will. Let me say this again for people who don't think that this guy that's capable of doing what he's doing in Ukraine won't use tactical nuclear weapons if he feels like he's backed too far into a corner. This is something we're going to have to deal with. Of course he's evil. The evil empire continues. He's also got nuclear weapons. So as we're talking about these mass atrocities, we're going to have to figure out, still talk about, how do we get beyond this war? And chances are very good, unless the Russian people decide to put Putin out of power, which I don't think is going to happen. Vladimir Putin is still going to be in power in 2023, 2024. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with these two competing realities.
Well, I mean, last week, we had reports of an internal poll in Russia that showed Vladimir Putin's popularity has soared. It's up to 86% in that country. President Biden has said publicly that he, meeting with Putin, told him that he thought he had no soul, and that Putin replied to him, well, at least we understand each other. He clearly does not have a soul. I think the larger issue here might...
He also, for him, unfortunately, he doesn't have an army, but go ahead.
That's true. That is true as well.
Not a functioning army.
That is true. They prove it every hour of each and every day. But the larger issue here might well be, in terms of winding down this war, hopefully it could be done sooner rather than later. What do you do with negotiations? Do you give up? Do you cede an inch of territory to the Russians after this? How can you do that?
Let's get to that in a minute.
And how can there be any trust in those negotiations? Helene Cooper, you've got some new...
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.